Hi, students in Paul as Local Theologian. This is a lecture, another lecture on Paul as a theologian. And I would title this lecture Critical Questions Related to Paul's Theology and Pauline Theology. With this lecture, like the lecture from the preceding week, I want to take our short chapter, our short reading, in addition to our reading from the Kim textbook, as a way of entering into this larger conversation about Paul as a theologian. And just like our discussion last week, in many ways, this week's conversation with Joette Bassler's chapter on Paul and Pauline theology is effectively entering into an ongoing, somewhat technical or specialized conversation on Paul as a theologian. I want to give a brief outline of this article. I want to highlight three things about this article. First, what she does in the critical review or the analysis of previous attempts to discuss Paul's theology or to provide explanations or proposals for analyzing Paul's theology. Then I want to talk briefly about her proposal and how she demonstrates her proposal by working through the first few verses of 1 Thessalonians. Let me say this, first of all, by way of introduction to the material where she is critically assessing, she's critically analyzing previous attempts to identify Paul's theology. I think that the reason I've selected this article is because this part of the article is rich in resources. And it would be great if after a class like this, you walk away wanting to know more about Paul and about how we understand Paul and how we identify or locate Paul's theology or Paul's core beliefs or his convictions or what have you. And so I think one of the purposes of our class together is really just to sort of turn this question about Paul as a theologian over and over and over. So to continue to sort of shift it just a little bit to look at it from another angle, shift it to look at it from another angle. And of course, always to do so with the concepts of local theology in mind. And so one of the reasons why I really appreciate what Bassler does in this very short article or short chapter is that she gives you a list of major voices or major components or areas of this argument related to Paul as theologian and Paul's theology. So I want to commend this piece to you as an entry point into further study of Paul. In as much as she summarizes and engages and even critiques these former attempts at answering these questions related to Paul as a theologian, she also provides access into some of the major contours of the debate. And for that, we should all be very grateful. Bassler breaks up her discussion of these previous attempts to deal with Pauline theology in three basic ways. So the first is about attempts to define the theology of individual letters. And this, I think, was a very early and it's a very popular approach to understanding Pauline theology, where really you're trying to have a descriptive and isolated account of the particular theology of a particular letter. Whether that be Galatians or 1 Thessalonians or 2 Thessalonians, what you're trying to do is describe as clearly as possible what is the theology, the substance, the basic and deep theological convictions of one letter without looking to the other letters of Paul or Acts to sort of fill in the blanks, but really treating each letter as the source of theology for that letter. And as Bassler points out, what scholars have done is they've either paid attention to the argument, that's the first sort of approach within this attempt. The second is to think more in terms of how Paul is responding to a particular theological position or theological misunderstanding of the community. So there's an argument component to that second type of this approach, but it's also focusing more on the community. And then a third sort of variant would be thinking of the theological event of the letter reading, as J. Louis Martin suggests with Galatians. And I think, again, what Bassler does for us is helps us understand how people have gone about trying to describe the theology of an individual letter using various means. And I think one of the things that she points out is that even if all Pauline scholars agreed that was the way forward, what results is still a pretty significant difference, a pretty significant diversity of understandings of methodology and of sort of outcomes for this approach. The second attempt to sort of understand Paul's theology is the more synthetic approach. And this is, again, balancing what we saw with Becker of coherence and contingency. It's, again, that balancing of it, but it's trying to synthesize from a close reading of all of the letters of Paul and their distinctive theological work or theological perspectives into a more synthesized sort of creation, I would say interpretation of Paul's theology. I think it should be evident that this is a good amount of interpretation on the part of the scholar. There is a degree of sort of mind reading or reading behind the text to sort of identify the core or the central convictions that guide Paul's theology and theological work in all of his letters. And you might not be surprised to know that there is, again, a great diversity of approaches. And Bassler holds up this wonderful quotation from Robin Scroggs that I'll highlight for you. Scroggs basically says that interpreters of Paul may find coherence in his letters, theological coherence in his letters, but that they shouldn't mistake the coherence that they have found for the so-called core of Paul. Again, this highlights, I think, that yes, scholars may read the 13 letters of Paul and say, here is the coherence. This is the coherent theme or the coherent idea. But it's a mistake to assume that scholarly construction, that scholarly interpretation is the same as what might have been the core theological convictions of Paul. Again, that's a pretty pessimistic or critical view of what interpreters and scholars are doing with Pauline interpretation, but I think it's so clearly stated and so helpfully defined. A second sort of variant of that synthetic account is represented by the work of Richard Hayes, who teaches and was the former dean of the Divinity School at Duke Divinity School, and his very important book about the narrative substructure of Paul's gospel. And so Hayes draws on some concepts of narrative to say that sort of this broad story, this long story from Abraham all the way to the Lord's return sort of undergirds all of Paul's letters. And it's the sort of the foundation or the core or the conviction from which Paul does all of his other theological work. And I think, as you'll see with Bassler, she takes some issues with this for a number of reasons. Again, I think primarily is the degree to which we can find that story, that supposed story in all 13 letters of Paul, and the degree to which we can have access to the mind of Paul, sort of other than what is revealed to us in the letters of Scripture. She then discusses just a couple of other models that have been circulating. In some ways, I think these later models that she discusses are introduced because the attempt to define the theology of an individual letter and the attempts to define a synthetic account of Pauline theology have all sort of had mixed results. And so she talks about, the idea of Paul's letters as a puzzle, and this idea that you're sort of trying to fit together the pieces of the puzzle. But sometimes either the puzzle pieces change or the picture on the puzzle itself changes. And you can imagine how difficult it would be to build a puzzle without a single picture on it, right? If you're a puzzle builder like my wife. The other one that she suggests is that of a lens. That Paul's theology is sort of a lens through which he understands what's going on in the world around him, specifically what's going on in the communities to whom or to which he writes. And again, I think Bassler is helpful here. She highlights that, once again, this lends itself to a static approach to Pauline theology. This view that Paul's theology was crystallized after that Damascus Road experience, and that all we need to do is sort of read between the lines of his letters and we'll find this sort of deposit, this static deposit of theology. And what she does for the rest of her article, and what I've been emphasizing in this class, is that we think about theology not as a set of convictions, not as information, not as a system that we memorize, but as an activity. And that if we want to understand Paul as theologian, if we want to understand Paul's theology, it is best to try to understand it as an activity. So using Paul's letters not as an access point or as a portal to get behind them into the brain of Paul, but rather using them as examples, exhibits of Paul's theological work. I think that that's a really, really important piece for our class and for our understanding of Paul in general. In her proposal, she draws on this idea of lens, right? Of this optical metaphor or optical analogy. And she says that first we have what she calls the raw material. And she says this is the story of Christ's death and resurrection. It's scripture, it's tradition. I think we could probably describe it as tradition, right? That this is the raw material that Paul has, that is sort of out there. But that this raw material is always refracted through or perceived through the lens of Paul's own experience, both his sort of unique experience, but also a more common experience of being human in the first century. And so Paul isn't reading Genesis like everyone else would read Genesis. Paul is reading Genesis, that tradition, he's drawing on that tradition through the lens of his experience as a pastor, as a community organizer, as an apostle, and so forth. So we have raw material, which is tradition. We have experience, which is the second, and what results through that first instance is what Bassler calls a coherent set of convictions. So we have tradition plus experience leads to something like convictions, and that then these convictions are further sort of refracted. They're further seen through the lens or the prism, she calls, of a situation in a community, and that then results on a sort of particular word on target, that language that we saw from Becker. Now, I think that this proposal that she offers of the raw material and the lens and the prism of the perception of the situation is important for a number of reasons. One of those being just the dynamic and important role of experience. Right? We've seen experience again and again and again in our discussions of local theology. And that seems to be a key component for what Bassler is doing in trying to shift our attention from theology as a static thing to theology in Paul as a active or dynamic or activity sort of thing. In her proposal, she offers what I think are really foundational, really sort of, they're almost commonsensical questions, but they're so important for our analysis of the Pauline letters. She says, first of all, we should ask what resources has Paul used and how has he used them? So what are the resources? What is the raw material that he's used in his letters to make his arguments, and how is he using them? So again, it's not just Paul quotes from Genesis or Paul quotes from Deuteronomy. We would also be asking, how does Paul quote from it? Is he pulling a phrase? Is he pulling a word? Is he pulling an idea? Do we assume that Paul thinks that his audiences have the whole literary context of that quotation in mind, or just that verse? That, I think, is a really pivotal question for trying to discern, for trying to see the how of Paul's letters and not just the what of Paul's letters. And then the second question she asks us to pay attention to is, what theological conceptions and religious convictions have consistently structured the argument, and how have they done so? Again, the question is not what are the religious conceptions or the theological convictions, right? It's not what are these pre-existing, pre-formulated convictions that are sort of applied in a situation. Rather, it's looking at a letter and saying, what is driving this argument? What convictions, what sensibilities are driving this argument, and how are they doing so? And I think Bassler says if we pay attention to those questions, we will see more clearly different aspects of Paul's theologizing. In the more constructive section of the article, as I mentioned at the beginning, Bassler deals with a few verses from 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. And really, she focuses in just on one particular specific set of questions related to his convictions. And again, what I hope that you realize is just how deep her analysis can go by simply focusing on convictions. There would be a whole nother piece if she was focusing on other aspects of this. And as she says in the article, that once she's looked at these verses, she would then look for those same convictions or similar convictions elsewhere in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, and then maybe elsewhere in the Pauline corpus. So I think she demonstrates what I would call the thick description of Paul's doing theology. I think her conclusion is important for our class, where she says that what we need to be looking for is the messy topic of Paul's theologizing. Again, the messy, unpredictable, unstructured examples of Paul's theology in action. And I think this is one of the reasons I think that this course is important, is that I have a hunch that local theology gives us some resources, some concepts, maybe some language for exploring the topic of theologizing. Remember that one of the core things that we've emphasized in this class up to this point is that local theology reminds us that theology is a dynamic process. It's not a static set of beliefs. It's an ongoing, reflective, and active reality or process. And so I think that whereas Bassler ends the article sort of with an exhortation that we pay attention to the messy topic of Paul's theologizing, to the act of Paul's theologizing, I actually think that local theology gives us some resources. And I just want to highlight two. I think the first is we could easily make some connections with the doing theology spiral that we talked about in the first part of the semester. I think that we could easily take some of what Bassler has suggested in this chapter and match up sort of Paul's letters, an individual letter of Paul as falling within this spiral, right? Where is the raw material? Where's the tradition? Where is the perception of the event, right? How does this all fall on the spiral? And then again, I think a second way of connecting this would be with very early on in the course with our work with Bevins and his suggestion that all contextual or local theology grows out of the interaction between the gospel, tradition, culture, and social change. And again, I think that those four categories would give us certain things to look for in the letters of Paul, in the individual letters of Paul, and maybe eventually in a synthetic account of Paul's letters. I want to conclude this lecture just with a short note, a short gesture towards the textbook that we've been using on Paul by Kim. And I hope that as we've sort of done a deeper dive into the questions related to Paul's theology and Paul as theologian with these two chapters, one by Becker and one by Bassler, that I hope that you understand some of what Kim is doing in this textbook. And I hope you recognize the degree to which his work is an interpretation, that his work is a movement towards synthesis, so that what he sort of provides in the first couple of chapters is the sort of core or the coherence, and that then he sort of fleshes that out as he analyzes the 7 undisputed letters of Paul. Now, of course, each of those has their own distinctive features, but I hope that you're aware and you're able to sort of sort out the ways in which Kim is participating in this enterprise known as Pauline theology, this enterprise that is seeking to identify either the theology of an individual letter or the synthetic account of all of Paul's theology. I hope that as you read through the Kim textbook and finish it this week, that you'll begin to see sort of how those dynamics are at play in his work. And that is not in any ways to minimize his work, but it is an opportunity to sort of give it some connection with other parts of the course, as well as with the guild that is the focusing on Paul and Pauline theology. Well, that is all that I have for this lecture. I, again, hope that it is opening up new ways for you to think about Paul and Paul's letters, but also is hopefully giving you an introduction to what I think is a fascinating and energizing field of study within New Testament scholarship. Thank you so much, as always, for your time and your attention.